Joseph and His Friend, A Story of Pennsylvania. Chapter 3, The Place and People. Joseph Asten's nature was shy and sensitive, but not merely from a habit of introversion. He saw no deeper into himself, in fact, than his moods and sensations, and thus quite failed to recognize what it was that kept him apart from the society in which he should have freely moved. He felt the difference of others, and constantly probed the pain and embarrassment it gave him. But the sources wherefrom it grew were the last which he would have guessed. A boy's life may be weakened for growth in all its fibers by the watchfulness of a too anxious love and the guidance of a too exquisitely nurtured conscience. He may be so trained in the habits of goodness and purity and duty that every contact with the world is like an abrasion upon the delicate surface of his soul. Every wind visits him too roughly, and he shrinks from the encounters which brace true manliness and strengthen it for the exercise of good. The rigid piety of Joseph's mother was warmed and softened by her tenderness towards him, and he never felt it as a yoke. His nature instinctively took the imprint of hers, and she was happy in seeing so clear a reflection of herself in his innocent young heart. She prolonged his childhood, perhaps without intending it, into the years when the unrest of approaching manhood should have led him to severer studies and lustier sports. Her death transferred his guardianship to other hands, but did not change its character. Her sister Rachel was equally good and conscientious, possibly with an equal capacity for tenderness, but her barren life had restrained the habit of its expression. Joseph could not but confess that she was guided by the strictest sense of duty, but she seemed to him cold, severe, unsympathetic. There were times when the alternative presented itself to his mind of either allowing her absolute control of all his actions or wounding her to the heart by asserting a moderate amount of independence. He was called fortunate, but it was impossible for him consciously to feel his fortune. The 200 acres of the farm, stretching back over the softly swelling hills which enclosed the valley on the east, were as excellent soil as the neighborhood knew. The stock was plentiful. The house, barn, and all the appointments of the place were in the best order, and he was the sole owner of all. The work of his own hands was not needed, but it was a mechanical exhaustion of time, an enforced occupation of body and mind, which he followed in the vague hope that some richer development of life might come afterwards. But there were times when the fields looked very dreary, when the trees, rooted in their places and growing under conditions which they were powerless to choose or change, were but tiresome types of himself, when even the beckoning heights far down the valley failed to touch his fancy with the hint of a broader world. Duty said to him, "You must be perfectly contented in your place." But there was the miserable, ungrateful, inexplicable fact of discontent. Furthermore, he had by this time discovered that certain tastes which he possessed were so many weaknesses, if not indeed matters of reproach, in the eyes of his neighbors. The delight and the torture of finer nerves, an inability to use coarse and strong phrases, and a shrinking from all display of rude manners, were peculiarities which he could not overcome, and must endeavor to conceal. There were men of sturdy intelligence in the community, but none of refined culture, through whom he might have measured and understood himself, and the very qualities, therefore, which should have been his pride, gave him only a sense of shame. Two memories haunted him after the evening at Warner's, and though so different, they were not to be disconnected. No two girls could be more unlike than Lucy Henderson and Miss Julia Blessing. He had known one for years, and the other was the partial acquaintance of an evening, yet the image of either one was swiftly followed by that of the other. When he thought of Lucy's eyes, Miss Julia's hand stole over his shoulder. When he recalled the glossy ringlets of the latter, he saw beside them the faintly flushed cheek and the pure, sweet mouth, which had awakened in him his first daring desire. Phantoms as they were, they seemed to have taken equal possession of the house, the garden, and the fields. While Lucy sat quietly by the window, Miss Julia skipped lightly along the adjoining hall. One lifted a fallen rose branch on the lawn, the other snatched the reddest blossom from it. One leaned against the trunk of the old hemlock tree, the other fluttered in and out among the clumps of shrubbery, but the lonely green was wonderfully brightened by these visions of pink and white, and Joseph enjoyed the fancy without troubling himself to think what it meant. The house was seated upon a gentle knoll, near the head of a side valley sunk like a dimple among the hills which enclosed the river meadows, scarcely a quarter of a mile away. It was nearly 100 years old, and its massive walls were faced with checkered bricks, alternately red and black, to which the ivy clung with tenacious feet wherever it was allowed to run. The gables terminated in broad, double chimneys, between which a railed walk, intended for a lookout but rarely used for that or any other purpose, rested on the peak of the roof. A low portico paved with stone extended along the front, which was further shaded by two enormous sycamore trees, as old as the house itself. The evergreens and ornamental shrubs which occupied the remainder of the little lawn denoted the taste of a later generation. To the east, an open, turfy space, in the center of which stood a superb weeping willow, divided the house from the great stone barn with its flanking cribs and overshoots. On the opposite side lay the sunny garden, with gnarled grapevines clambering along its walls, and a double row of tall old box bushes, each grown into a single solid mass, stretching down the center. The fields belonging to the property, softly rising and following the undulations of the hills, limited the landscape on three sides, but on the south there was a fair view of the valley of the larger stream, with its herd-speckled meadows, glimpses of water between the fringing trees, and farmhouses sheltered among the knees of the farther hills. It was a region of peace and repose and quiet, drowsy beauty, and there were few farms which were not the ancestral homes of the families who held them. The people were satisfied, for they lived upon a bountiful soil, and if but few were notably rich, still fewer were absolutely poor. They had a sluggish sense of content, a half-conscious feeling that their lines were cast in pleasant places. They were orderly, moral, and generally honest, and their own types were so constantly reproduced and fixed, both by intermarriage and intercourse, that any variation therein was a thing to be suppressed if possible. Any sign of an unusual taste or a different view of life excited their suspicion, and the most of them were incapable of discriminating between independent thought on moral and social questions and free thinking in the religious significance which they attached to the word. Political excitements, it is true, sometimes swept over the neighborhood, but in a mitigated form, and the discussions which then took place between neighbors of opposite faith were generally repetitions of the arguments furnished by their respective county papers. To one whose twofold nature conformed to the common mold, into whom, before his birth, no mysterious element had been infused, to be the basis of new sensations, desires, and powers. The region was a paradise of peaceful days. Even as a boy, the probable map of his life was drawn. He could behold himself as a young man, as husband, father, and comfortable old man by simply looking upon these various stages in others. If, however, his senses were not sluggish, but keen, if his nature reached beyond the ordinary necessities and hungered for the taste of higher things, if he longed to share in that life of the world, the least part of which was known to his native community, if, not content to accept the mechanical faith of passive minds, he dared to repeat the long struggle of the human race in his own spiritual and mental growth, then, why then the region was not a paradise of peaceful days. Rachel Miller, now that the dangerous evening was over, was shrewd enough to resume her habitual manner towards her nephew. Her curiosity to know what had been done and how Joseph had been affected by the merrymaking rendered her careful not to frighten him from the subject by warnings or reproaches. He was frank and communicative, and Rachel found, to her surprise, that the evening at Warrener's was much, and not wholly unpleasantly, in her thoughts during her knitting hours. The farm work was briskly forwarded. Joseph was active in the field, and decidedly brighter in the house, and when he announced the new engagement, with an air which hinted that his attendance was a matter of course, she was only able to say, "I'm very much mistaken if that's the end. Get a-going once, and there's no telling where you'll fetch up. I suppose that town's girl won't stay much longer. The farm work of the neighborhood couldn't stand it, and so she means to have all she can while her visit lasts." "Indeed, aunt," Joseph protested. "Elwood Withers first proposed it, and the others all agreed." "And ready enough they were, I'll be bound." "Yes, they were," Joseph replied, with a little more firmness than usual. "All of them, and there was no respectable family in the neighborhood that wasn't represented." Rachel made an effort and kept silence. The innovation might be temporary, and in that case it were prudent to take no further notice, or it might be the beginning of a change in the ways of the young people, and if so, she needed further knowledge in order to work successfully against it in Joseph's case. She little suspected how swiftly and closely the question would be brought to her own door. A week afterwards, the second of the evening parties was held, and was even more successful than the first. Everybody was there, bringing a cheerful memory of the former occasion, and Miss Julia Blessing, no longer dreaded as an unknown scrutinizing element, was again the life and soul of the company. It was astonishing how correctly she retained the names and characteristics of all those whom she had already met, and how intelligently she seemed to enjoy the gossip of the neighborhood. It was remarked that her dress was studiously simple, as if to conform to country ways, yet the airy, graceful freedom of her manner gave it a character of elegance which sufficiently distinguished her from the other girls. Joseph felt that she looked to him as by an innocent, natural instinct for a more delicate and intimate recognition than she expected to find elsewhere. Fragments of sentences, parenthetical expressions, dropped in her lively talk were always followed by a quick glance which said to him, "We have one feeling in common. I know that you understand me." He was fascinated, but the experience was so new that it was rather bewildering. He was drawn to catch her seemingly random looks, to wait for them, and then shrink timidly when they came, feeling all the while the desire to be in the quiet corner outside the merry circle of talkers, where sat Lucy Henderson. When at last a change in the diversions of the evening brought him to Lucy's side, she seemed to him grave and preoccupied. Her words lacked the pleasant directness and self-possession which had made her society so comfortable to him. She no longer turned her full face towards him while speaking, and he noticed that her eyes were wandering over the company with a peculiar expression, as if she were trying to listen with them. It seemed to him also that Elwood Withers, who was restlessly moving about the room, was watching someone or waiting for something. "I have it!" suddenly cried Miss Blessing, floating towards Joseph and Lucy. "It shall be you, Mr. Asten." "Yes," echoed Anna Warner, following. "If it could be, how delightful." "Hush, Anna dear, let us keep the matter secret," whispered Miss Blessing, assuming a mysterious air. "We will slip away and consult, and of course Lucy must come with us." "Now," she resumed, when the four found themselves alone in the old-fashioned dining-room, "we must first of all explain everything to Mr. Asten. The question is where we shall meet next week. McNaughtons are building an addition, I believe you call it, to their barn, and a child has the measles at another place, and something else is wrong somewhere else. We cannot interfere with the course of nature, but neither should we give up these charming evenings without making an effort to continue them. Our sole hope and reliance is on you, Mr. Asten." She pronounced the words with a mock solemnity, clasping her hands and looking into his face with bright, eager, laughing eyes. "If it depended on myself," Joseph began. "Oh, I know the difficulty, Mr. Asten," she exclaimed, "and really it's unpardonable in me to propose such a thing. But isn't it possible, just possible, that Miss Miller might be persuaded by us?" "Julia, dear," cried Anna Warner, "I believe there's nothing you'd be afraid to undertake." Joseph scarcely knew what to say. He looked from one to the other, coloring slightly, and ready to turn pale the next moment, as he endeavored to imagine how his aunt would receive such an astounding proposition. "There is no reason why she should be asked," said Lucy. "It would be a great annoyance to her." "Indeed?" said Miss Blessing. "Then I should be so sorry. But I caught a glimpse of your lovely place the other day as we were driving up the valley. It was a perfect picture, and I have such a desire to see it nearer." "Why will you not come then?" Joseph eagerly asked. Lucy's words seemed to him blunt and unfriendly, although he knew they had been intended for his relief. "It would be a great pleasure. Yet if I thought your aunt would be annoyed, I am sure she will be glad to make your acquaintance," said Joseph, with a reproachful side glance at Lucy. Miss Blessing noticed the glance. "I am more sure," she said playfully, "that she will be very much amused at my ignorance and inexperience, and I don't believe Lucy meant to frighten me. As for the party, we won't think of that now, but you will go with us, Lucy, won't you, with Anna and myself, to make a neighborly afternoon call?" Lucy felt obliged to accede to a request so amiably made after her apparent rudeness, yet she could not force herself to affect a hearty acquiescence, and Joseph thought her singularly cold. He did not doubt but that Miss Blessing, whose warm, impulsive nature seemed to him very much what his own might be if he dared to show it, would fulfill her promise. Neither did he doubt that so much innocence and sweetness as she possessed would make a favorable impression upon his aunt, but he judged it best not to inform the latter of the possible visit.